My parents put the dinner bill in front of me and said, "Since you're the only one who doesn't have children, you can afford to pay for everyone." For a few seconds I honestly thought they were joking. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to laugh. Nobody did. My mother simply folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. My father leaned back in his chair, as if he had just made the most reasonable request in the world. My older sister Emily kept scrolling through her phone while her husband Mark quietly finished his drink. And my younger brother, Daniel, suddenly became very interested in the tablecloth. I looked down at the bill again. $486. $486. For one family dinner. Then I looked at my father. "Dad, are you serious?" He shrugged. "Of course I'm serious. You're doing well. You have a good job, you live alone, and you don't have kids. You have fewer responsibilities than the rest of us." My mother nodded. "That's what we were saying before you arrived. It only makes sense." I stared at them. That sentence hurt more than I wanted to admit. Not because of the money, because they had reduced my entire life to a simple calculation. No children, no husband, no mortgage, therefore I must have money, therefore I must pay. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last 3 years building a life that nobody at that table had ever bothered to understand. And what they definitely didn't know was that the money sitting in my bank account was not what they thought it was. I took a slow breath. "Okay," I said. My father smiled. "That's my girl." I picked up the bill. But I didn't pay it. Not yet. Because that dinner was about to become the night my entire family learned something they had never expected to hear from me. My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. I work as a project manager for a software company in Chicago. I'm not rich. I'm not struggling either. I make enough to live comfortably, save a little, and occasionally treat myself without checking my bank balance first. At least, that's what my family believed. For years, they had made assumptions about me. Because I lived alone, they assumed I had no financial pressure. Because I didn't have children, they assumed I had no real responsibilities. Because I rarely complained, they assumed everything in my life was easy. And because I never asked them for money, they assumed I had plenty of it. The truth was very different. I had chosen to live below my means. I drove an 8-year-old car. I rented a modest apartment. I rarely bought expensive clothes. I cooked at home most nights. And every month I automatically transferred money into a separate savings account. That account wasn't for vacations. It wasn't for a luxury car. It wasn't for some future wedding. It was for my parents. Yes, my parents. For the last 3 years, I had been quietly saving money, because I knew their financial situation wasn't as stable as they pretended it was. They had never asked me for help. But I had seen the warning signs. My father had retired earlier than expected after the company he worked for downsized. My mother had been working part-time at a local medical office, but her hours had been reduced. They had credit card debt. They had a small second mortgage. And they had started borrowing money from Emily. At least, that was what I thought. Emily was 36, married, and had 2 children. She constantly talked about how expensive everything was. Daycare, groceries, school supplies, medical bills, car payments. Every conversation somehow came back to money. And whenever our parents complained about their finances, Emily would immediately say, "We're struggling too." So I started helping quietly, not by handing them cash. I paid a few bills. I covered a repair on their furnace. I paid their property tax one year when Dad told me they were short. I even transferred money to Mom when she said she needed help with a medical expense. They always promised they would pay me back. I never pressured them. I told myself it wasn't important. They were my parents. Family helps family. At least, that's what I believed, but over time something began to bother me. I noticed that whenever I helped, nobody mentioned it. Not even a simple thank you. Instead, my family continued treating me like the lucky daughter who had no responsibilities. And that night at dinner, I finally understood why. We had all met at a restaurant downtown to celebrate my mother's birthday. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner. My parents, Emily and Mark, their 2 kids, Daniel, and me. Nothing unusual, except Emily arrived almost 40 minutes late. She walked in wearing a designer coat I knew cost more than my monthly rent. Behind her, Mark carried a brand new smartphone box under his arm. I noticed it immediately. "New phone?" I asked. Mark smiled. "Yeah, my old one was getting slow." I laughed. "Nice. Emily sat down and started looking through the menu. I hope they have that steak, she said. Mom smiled. You always order the steak. Emily shrugged. It's Mom's birthday, we should celebrate. I didn't think much of it at the time. Dinner was actually pleasant for the first hour. We talked about work. The kids talked about school. Mom told a story about something that happened at her office. Dad complained about traffic. Everyone laughed. Then dessert arrived. And that's when Dad changed the subject. He looked at me. Sarah, how's work going? Pretty good. Still getting bonuses? Sometimes. How much did you get last year? I frowned. Why? He laughed. I'm just asking. Emily suddenly looked up from her phone. I heard project managers make pretty good money. I shrugged. Some do. My mother smiled. You've always been good with money. I didn't respond. Something about the conversation felt strange. Dad took a sip of coffee. You know, your mother and I have been talking about finances lately. I immediately knew where this was going. Is everything okay? Mom waved her hand. Nothing serious. Dad nodded. We're just trying to be more careful. Then came the bill. The server placed it on the table. Dad picked it up. He looked at it for a moment. Then he pushed it toward me. Sarah can take this one. I smiled awkwardly. What? Dad laughed. Come on, you've got it. I thought he meant I should pay for the birthday dinner. That wouldn't have bothered me. So I reached for my wallet. Then he added those words. Since you're the only one who doesn't have children, you can afford to pay for everyone. The entire table went silent. I looked at Emily. She didn't say anything. I looked at Mark. He looked away. Daniel stared at his plate. Mom simply nodded. And suddenly, the entire dinner felt different. I put my wallet down. Dad, that's almost $500. He shrugged. You make more than us. I never said I wouldn't pay for dinner. Then what's the problem? I stared at him. The problem is that you make it sound like my life is somehow less expensive because I don't have children. Dad sighed. Oh, Sarah, don't make this emotional. That sentence stayed with me. Don't make this emotional. As if being treated unfairly was simply an emotional reaction. Emily finally spoke. Honestly, Sarah, you don't have to take it personally. I looked at her. I'm not. She smiled. You kind of are. I almost laughed. Because Emily was the last person who should have been giving me financial advice. She had been borrowing money from our parents for years, and according to Mom, our parents were struggling, so I asked the question I should have asked a long time ago. Emily, when was the last time you paid Mom and Dad back? Her smile disappeared. What does that have to do with anything? I'm just asking. Mark shifted in his chair. Dad immediately interrupted. This isn't the time. No, I said quietly. Maybe it is. Mom looked uncomfortable. Sarah, please. But I couldn't stop, not anymore. Because I'm tired of hearing that I don't have responsibilities. Dad's expression hardened. You don't. I stared at him. You really believe that? Yes. I took a breath. Okay. I reached into my purse. Everyone watched me. I pulled out my phone. I opened my banking app. Then I turned the screen toward my father. I have responsibilities you don't know about. Dad looked at the screen. His face changed. Not because of the balance, because of the transaction history. At the top were several payments: property tax, furnace repair, medical bill, mortgage assistance, utility bill, and several transfers directly to my mother's account. Dad stared at the screen. What is this? Mom leaned closer. Her face went pale. I didn't answer immediately. I just scrolled. Then I said quietly, That's the money I've been sending you for the last 3 years. Nobody spoke. Emily looked at me. What? I turned toward her. I never told you because Mom and Dad asked me not to. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Sarah, Dad looked confused. You paid these? Yes, why? I laughed softly. Because you needed help. Dad shook his head. We didn't ask you to do that. You didn't have to. He looked at Mom. Mom lowered her eyes. Then I said something that made everyone at the table uncomfortable. I thought I was helping my parents. I looked at Emily. But apparently I was just helping a family that thought I was the one who needed less. Emily crossed her arms. That doesn't mean you should bring it up at dinner. I didn't bring it up. I pointed toward the bill. You did. Nobody had an answer. The server walked by and asked if everything was okay. Dad immediately said yes. I almost smiled. Everything was not okay. Not anymore. We eventually paid the bill. But I did not pay the whole thing. I paid for my meal and my mother's birthday dessert. Dad looked furious. Emily looked offended. Mark looked embarrassed. And Daniel quietly thanked me. As we walked outside, Dad followed me. Sarah, I stopped. What? He lowered his voice. You embarrassed your mother. I stared at him. I embarrassed Mom. Yes. Dad, you put a $486 bill in front of me because I don't have children. You could have handled it privately. I've been handling everything privately for 3 years. He didn't respond. I continued. I never told anyone about the money. I never asked for recognition. I never complained. Dad looked away. So what do you want? I looked directly at him. I want you to stop treating me like my life is somehow worth less because I don't have a husband or kids. His face softened for half a second. Then he said, That's not what we meant. Then what did you mean? He had no answer. I went home that night angry, but I wasn't crying. That surprised me. Usually when my family hurt me, I cried. That night, I didn't. I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and started reviewing every financial record I had. I wanted to know exactly how much money I had given my parents. Not because I wanted it back, because I needed to understand what had actually happened. I opened a spreadsheet. I entered every payment. January, March, June, September. Then another year. Then another. The total kept growing. $1,200, $3,400, $7,850, $11,600. Then I reached the bottom. My hands stopped moving. The total was over $18,000. $18,000. I stared at the number. Then I remembered something. My mother had once told me that Emily had been struggling financially. She had asked me to help because Emily has children. I had accepted that. I had understood it. But suddenly I started wondering where all that money had gone. I opened my messages. I searched for conversations with Mom. There were dozens. Could you help with the electricity bill? Dad's car needs a repair. Can you send $600? It's urgent. Please don't tell Emily. Your father doesn't want anyone to know. I read every message. Then I noticed something. One message from 2 years earlier. Mom had written, Emily is having a difficult month. We had to help her with her credit card. I stared at it. I had never known that. Then another message. Please don't mention this to Sarah. She already worries too much. I froze. They had hidden things from me, but why? I kept scrolling. And that's when I found something I had completely forgotten. A message from Dad. It was only one sentence. Don't worry, Sarah. The house will eventually make everything fair. I read it 3 times. The house. I knew my parents' house was valuable, very valuable. They had owned it for almost 25 years. The neighborhood had changed dramatically, and property values had increased. I had never cared about inheritance. Not once. I had always told my parents that whatever they wanted to do with their property was their decision. But now I wondered what Dad meant by, make everything fair. I called Mom. She didn't answer. I called Dad. He didn't answer either. 10 minutes later, Mom texted me. It's late, can we talk tomorrow? I replied, sure, but I knew I wasn't going to sleep. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was Emily. Why did you embarrass everyone tonight? I stared at the message. Then another appeared. You always act like you're better than us. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, I wrote, I don't think I'm better than anyone. She replied immediately. Then stop making everything about money. I laughed. Actually laughed. Because I hadn't mentioned money until my father put the bill in front of me. I wrote, okay? She responded, good, then we're done. I put the phone down. But 5 minutes later, another message arrived. This one was different. Also, don't tell Mom and Dad that I asked you, but can you lend me $2,000? I stared at the screen. I couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened at dinner, she was still asking me for money. I didn't answer. She sent another message. It's urgent. Then, please, then? I'm serious, Sarah. I finally typed. What is the $2,000 for? She didn't answer for almost an hour. Then she wrote, it's complicated. I replied, then explain it. Nothing. I went to bed without responding further. The next morning, I woke up to 7 missed calls. 4 from Mom, 3 from Dad. I immediately knew something was wrong. I called Mom. She answered on the first ring. Sarah, where are you? At home. Can you come over? Why? There was silence. Then she whispered, your father found out something about Emily. My heart started beating faster. What happened? I can't explain over the phone. Mom, tell me. She started crying. Please just come. I drove to my parents' house. When I arrived, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked exhausted. Mom was standing near the sink. Emily was there too. Her eyes were red. Mark was nowhere to be seen. I walked inside. Nobody greeted me. I sat down. What happened? Dad looked at Emily, then at me. Your sister owes a lot more money than we thought. Emily started crying. Dad continued. Credit cards, personal loans, late payments. I looked at Emily. How much? She covered her face. Dad answered, almost $40,000. I was stunned. Then Mom said something that made the entire situation even worse. Some of that money came from your parents. I looked at Dad. How much? He didn't answer. I already knew. Dad, he finally whispered. About $23,000. My stomach dropped. $23,000. And suddenly, everything made sense. The designer coat, the new phone, the expensive dinners, the vacations Emily had posted online. The things I had assumed were harmless luxuries. I looked at my parents. You told me you were struggling. Dad looked down. We were. You were struggling because you were paying her debts. Mom started crying. She has children. I closed my eyes. There it was again. The same sentence. She has children. As if having children meant you could never be responsible for your own choices. As if not having children meant I had an unlimited supply of money. I stood up. I need to ask one question. Everyone looked at me. Why did you ask me to pay that dinner bill last night? Dad didn't respond. Neither did Mom. I looked at Emily. She looked away. Then Dad finally said, because we thought you could help us. I nodded slowly. With what? He swallowed. With the house. My heart stopped. What about the house? Dad looked at Mom. Mom whispered. We were thinking about selling it. I stared at them. And giving the money to Emily? Nobody answered. That silence was enough. I felt something inside me break. Not because of the money, because suddenly I realized the truth. The dinner bill had never been about dinner. It had been a test. They wanted to see how much I would still sacrifice for the family. And I had just failed their test by refusing. Dad reached across the table. Sarah, please listen. I stepped back. No, it's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. He looked at me. And then he said the one thing I never expected. Your mother and I already signed the paperwork. I froze. What paperwork? Dad looked at Emily, then back at me. The house. I could barely breathe. What did you sign? Dad's voice was almost a whisper. We changed the ownership arrangement. I stared at him. To what? He didn't answer. I looked at my mother. She was crying. Then I looked at Emily. And for the first time that morning she looked directly at me. There was no guilt in her expression, only fear. And that's when I realized there was something else. Something much bigger than a dinner bill. Something my family had been hiding from me for months. And whatever was written on those papers could change everything, forever. I walked toward the door. Dad called after me. Sarah, wait. I stopped but didn't turn around. Why? He said. Because you deserve to know the whole truth. I slowly turned back. What truth? Dad looked at Mom, then at Emily. Nobody spoke. Finally my mother whispered, the house isn't the only thing we've been hiding from you. I stared at my mother. For a moment, nobody moved. The kitchen felt smaller than it had a few seconds earlier. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. A car passed outside. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and then went silent. But inside that kitchen, there was nothing but silence. I looked at my father. What else? He rubbed his hands together. I don't know how to tell you this. Then tell me badly. He looked at Mom. She nodded. Dad finally said, the house isn't paid off. I blinked. What? We still have a mortgage. I frowned. I know you have a mortgage. No, Dad said quietly. You don't understand. He pushed a folder across the table. I didn't touch it. What am I supposed to understand? Dad swallowed. We took out another loan against the house 2 years ago. My stomach tightened. For what? He looked at Emily. Nobody answered. I already knew. Her debts? Dad nodded. Some of them. I stared at Emily. She looked down. How much? Dad said, 30,000. I felt like someone had punched the air out of my lungs. $30,000. We thought we'd be able to pay it back. With what? Dad didn't answer. I laughed bitterly. You didn't have the money to pay it back, so you started borrowing from me. Mom began crying. Sarah, we never intended to hurt you. I looked at her. You didn't intend to? My voice shook. You took money from me for 3 years while secretly using your own house to cover Emily's debts. Mom covered her face. Dad looked exhausted. Your mother and I were trying to keep the family together. No, I said. You were trying to keep Emily's problems from becoming visible. Emily suddenly stood up. That's not fair. I turned toward her. Not fair? She wiped her tears. You don't know what it's like having 2 kids. No, I said quietly, I don't. You have no idea how expensive everything is. I know. No, you don't. I looked at her. I know exactly how expensive life is. That's why I don't spend money I don't have. Her face tightened. You think you're better than me. I never said that. You don't have to say it. I shook my head. This isn't about being better. Then what is it about? I looked at my parents. It's about being honest. Nobody spoke. I picked up the folder. Inside were copies of the mortgage documents. I read through them. The loan was real. The house had been used as collateral, and the numbers were worse than I expected. My parents were dangerously close to losing the home they had lived in for more than 20 years. I closed the folder. Why didn't you tell me? Dad looked at me. Because we knew you'd try to fix it. I stared at him. And you thought that was worse than lying to me? He lowered his head. Yes. That answer hurt more than anything else. Because he was right. If they had told me 2 years ago, I probably would have tried to help. I would have worked extra hours. I would have cut my own expenses. I would have found a way. But instead, they had decided that I was easier to manipulate if I didn't know the truth. I stood up. I need to leave. Mom reached for my hand. Sarah, please. I stepped away. I'm not angry because you need help. I looked at both of them. I'm angry because you made me feel selfish for having a life of my own. Dad's eyes filled with tears. You're right. I stopped. It was the first time he'd admitted it. He looked at me. We were wrong. Emily sat silently at the table. I turned toward her. And you. She looked up. What? You need to tell me the truth. I already did. No. I shook my head. You haven't. She frowned. What else do you want to know? Where did the money go? She looked confused. What money? The money from Mom and Dad. She didn't answer. I continued. The $23,000. Her face changed. I didn't spend all of that. Then where did it go? She looked at Dad. He said nothing. Finally, Emily whispered. Some of it went toward the kids. I nodded. How much? She hesitated. Maybe 5,000. And the rest? Silence. Then Mark walked into the kitchen. Nobody had heard him come in. He looked at Emily. Tell her. Emily's eyes widened. Mark. Tell her. I looked at him. What happened? He sighed. I lost my job last year. I stared at him. What? I was laid off. Emily looked at him. Why didn't you tell me you were going to say that? Because she deserves to know. He turned toward me. Most of the money went toward our debts. I looked at Emily. Credit cards? Mark nodded. Credit cards, car payments, a personal loan. I couldn't believe it. You bought a new phone while your parents were borrowing against their house. Mark looked ashamed. The phone was financed. That doesn't make it better. I know. Emily began crying again. I was scared. I looked at her. Of what? Of losing everything. I took a breath. You almost made Mom and Dad lose everything. She looked down. I know. For the first time I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Completely exhausted. I had spent years believing that family meant protecting each other. But I had confused protection with secrecy. And I had confused love with sacrifice. That afternoon, I went home. I didn't speak to anyone for 3 days. No calls, no texts, no visits. I needed time. During those 3 days, I did something I should have done years earlier. I looked at my own finances. I realized I had spent so much time worrying about my family's financial problems that I had neglected my own future. My retirement savings were behind. My emergency fund was smaller than it should have been. And the money I had given my parents wasn't money I could easily replace. For the first time, I asked myself a difficult question. What would happen if I stopped rescuing everyone? The answer was frightening. Maybe people would have to rescue themselves. On the 4th day, Dad called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Hello? Sarah? His voice sounded different, tired. I need to apologize. I said nothing. He continued. I've been thinking about what you said. Okay. You were right. I closed my eyes. About what? Everything. There was a long silence. Then he said, Your mother and I have been unfair to you. I didn't respond. We always saw you as the strong one. That isn't an excuse. I know. He sighed. We thought because you were independent, you didn't need us. I looked out the window. That's exactly the problem. What do you mean? You decided I didn't need anyone because I learned how to handle things myself. Dad was silent. I continued. Being strong doesn't mean you don't get tired, he whispered. I know. Then he asked, Will you come over tonight? I almost said no, but something told me I needed to hear what he had to say. When I arrived, the whole family was there. Mom, Dad, Emily, Mark, even Daniel. Dad had placed several documents on the table. He looked at me. We've made a decision. I sat down. What kind of decision? We're not selling the house. I looked confused. Then what? Dad pushed the documents toward me. We're selling some other things first. What things? Cars, investments, some valuables. Mom nodded. We're downsizing. I looked at them. And Emily? Dad looked at her. She and Mark are selling their second car. Emily nodded. They're also moving to a smaller apartment. Mark added. We're cutting our expenses. I didn't say anything. Dad continued. And we're meeting with a financial counselor tomorrow. I was surprised. That's good. Dad looked directly at me. And we're not asking you for money. I stared at him. Ever again. Mom began crying. Unless you offer it yourself. I nodded. That is how it should have been from the beginning. Dad reached for my hand. This time I let him. I am sorry. I looked at him. I believe you. He squeezed my hand. But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. I know. And I'm not paying off anyone's debts. I know. And I'm not taking responsibility for choices I didn't make. I know. He nodded. Then something unexpected happened. Emily stood up. She walked toward me. I owe you an apology. I looked at her. She was crying. I've been angry at you for years. Why? Because you always seemed like you had everything together. I almost smiled. I didn't. I know that now. She sat beside me. I thought you judged me. I never did. I know. She looked down. I was jealous. I was surprised by her honesty. Of what? Your freedom. I didn't know what to say. She continued. You could make decisions for yourself. You could change jobs, move cities, travel, spend a weekend doing absolutely nothing. She wiped her tears. I loved my children, Sarah. I still do. But sometimes I missed who I used to be. I nodded slowly. That doesn't make you a bad mother. I know. But it doesn't make your choices okay either. She nodded. I know that too. Then she said something that I would never forget. I should have asked for help instead of pretending everything was fine. I looked at her. That would have been easier. For everyone. Yes. For the first time in years we actually talked, not as sisters competing for approval, not as daughters comparing our lives, just as two women who had both made mistakes. Emily told me about her debt. Mark told me about losing his job. My parents told me how frightened they had been, and I told them something I had never said before. I felt invisible. Mom cried. Dad looked down. I continued. Every time you said I didn't have responsibilities, it made me feel like my life didn't count. Dad shook his head. Your life counts. I know that now. He looked at me. I wish we had told you sooner. So do I. A few weeks passed. Things didn't magically become perfect. They never do. My parents still had financial problems. Emily and Mark still had debt. They still had difficult conversations. But something changed. There were no more secret requests. No more hidden bills. No more guilt. No more, you don't have kids, so you can afford it. And then, one Saturday morning, Mom called me. Sarah, can you come over? I smiled. What's wrong? Nothing. Then why do you sound nervous? She laughed. Just come. When I arrived, she handed me an envelope. I looked at it. What is this? Open it. Inside was a check. I stared at the amount. $4,000. I looked at Mom. What is this? Part of what we owe you. I shook my head. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, we do. Dad walked into the room. He held another envelope. We sold the old car. He placed it on the table. That's another payment. I stared at them. You don't need to do this all at once. We know, Dad smiled. But we're going to make things right. I hugged them. For the first time in a long time, it felt like I was hugging my parents instead of carrying them. Over the next year they slowly paid me back. Not everything, not immediately, but they tried, and that mattered. Emily also changed. She started budgeting. She stopped using credit cards for things she couldn't afford. Mark found a new job. They moved into a smaller place. And surprisingly, Emily became happier. Not because she had more money, because she no longer had to pretend. One evening, about a year after that terrible dinner, we all met at the same restaurant, the same table, same family, same kind of dinner. I almost laughed when I saw the familiar menu. Dad noticed. What? Nothing, he smiled. Then the server brought the check. Everyone looked at it. Dad immediately picked it up. I raised an eyebrow. He laughed. No. He handed it to me. I looked at him suspiciously. Then he said, I've got it. Everyone laughed. I smiled. You sure? Dad nodded. I am absolutely sure. Emily laughed. Dad has been waiting a year to say that. Mom smiled. Dad looked around the table. This dinner is on me. I laughed. Even for the kids? He nodded. Especially the kids. We all laughed. But then Dad became serious. He looked at me. Sarah. Yeah? I want to say something. I nodded. He took a breath. I used to think having a family meant everyone had to sacrifice for everyone else. I listened. But I was wrong. He looked at Emily. Love isn't asking one person to carry everyone. Then he looked at me, and it isn't assuming the strongest person doesn't need help. My eyes filled with tears. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. Dad continued. Family should be the place where you can tell the truth. Nobody spoke. Then Emily said, even when the truth is ugly? Dad smiled. Especially then. We sat there quietly for a moment. The dinner continued. We talked. We laughed. We ordered dessert. And when the bill finally came, nobody pushed it toward me. Nobody looked at my bank account. Nobody mentioned children. Nobody compared salaries. For the first time, dinner was just dinner. A year earlier, I had walked out of that same restaurant feeling like my family saw me as a wallet. Now I sat at the same table feeling like a daughter again. And I realized something. The biggest lesson wasn't about money. It wasn't about the $486 bill. It wasn't even about the $18,000 I had given my parents. It was about boundaries. Sometimes you can love your family deeply and still say no. Sometimes helping someone means refusing to keep rescuing them. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop allowing people to depend on you in unhealthy ways. I had spent years thinking that saying no would make me a bad daughter. Instead, saying no forced my family to become honest. It forced my parents to face their financial problems. It forced my sister to face her debt. It forced me to face my own habit of sacrificing myself just to keep everyone else comfortable. And most importantly, it taught me that having no children did not mean having no responsibilities. I had responsibilities. I had dreams. I had fears. I had a future. And my life mattered just as much as everyone else's. As we left the restaurant that night, Dad walked beside me. He looked at me and smiled. You know something? What? You were never the daughter with fewer responsibilities. I smiled. What was I? He thought for a moment. You were the daughter we could always count on. I looked at him. And now? He smiled. Now you're the daughter we don't have to count on for everything. I laughed. That's probably healthier. It definitely is. We walked toward the parking lot together. Before getting into my car, I looked back at my family. Mom was laughing with Emily. Mark was helping the kids into the car. Dad was standing beside me. For the first time, nobody needed anything from me. And somehow, that felt like the greatest gift they had ever given me. The dinner bill had been $486. But what that dinner had cost me was much more. It cost me the illusion that my family would always treat me fairly. It cost me years of believing that being strong meant staying silent. It cost me the fear of saying no. But in return, I gained something much more valuable. My voice, my boundaries, and a family that finally understood that love isn't measured by how much money one person is willing to sacrifice. Sometimes love is simply sitting around the same table and knowing that everyone there is allowed to say no and still be loved. That night, I drove home alone. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I felt free. And when I thought about that $486 bill, I finally understood something. It was never really a dinner bill, it was the price of learning my worth.